Welcome, friends and comrades, to another panel discussion hosted by the International Manifesto Group, this time in conjunction with the Critical Theory Workshop and the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. The advance of socialist forces has, historically, featured an alliance between small but critical groups of intellectuals and the masses of workers. Marx and Lenin spoke of it. Gramsci spoke of an alliance between those who suffer because they think and those who think because they suffer. The Fabians spoke of an alliance of brains and numbers. The alliance of the thinkers with the left was such as to lead John Stuart Mill to call the conservative party of his country the stupid party. Today, however, even as the class of intellectuals or the educated has expanded to become a veritable professional managerial class, that alliance appears to have broken down. The vast majority of the educated classes express their own class interests and that of the corporate capitalist class, and are split, if at all, only among parties that represent corporate capitalist interests. Why is this? What is the resulting set of political alliances of the educated? What are the consequences? Should and can we rectify this? This is the subject of today's webinar. I will be doing the moderating. My name is Carlos L. Garrido. I'm a Cuban-American philosophy instructor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, the director at the Midwestern Marx Institute, and the author of various books, including The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview, and the forthcoming Hegel, Marxism and Dialectics. Our speakers for today are Glenn Dyson, Noah Krashevik, Gabriel Rockhill, myself, and Radhika Desai, in that order. So we'll get started with Glenn Dyson, who is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway and an editor of the Russia in Global Affairs Journal. You can follow him on Twitter, of course, at Glenn Dyson. That's Glenn with two N's and Dyson IE. So Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. You can get started with your presentation.
Thank you so much. So, yes, I was asked to speak a bit about some work I've been doing lately on think tanks and how they are, I guess, corrupted a lot of the knowledge and about, well, how knowledge itself is produced, and then especially focusing on how this think tank industry has influenced American policies towards Russia. So my main argument has been that think tanks has a tendency to corrupt knowledge itself, as the making or the production of knowledge decided to some extent by market forces, which is again the unfettered markets at its extremes. So, so I wouldn't say that think tanks would inherently be bad. Merely, I would say corrupted. Traditionally, I think think tanks has been this can be considered a bridge between academia and decision makers. That's how it started and was intended. So while academics tend to be very focused on development of theories, how methods are developed, often they tend to be very specifically focused on single topics, and it's not always that easy to have this cooperation with decision makers. And I think decision makers have a need for expert opinions, simply because as the world grew increasingly complex over the past 100 years, especially, politicians needed effectively to make decisions on everything from fiscal policies, foreign policies towards everything from Argentina to Ethiopia. So it's they're expected to know a lot of information. Also in the United States, this is happening at a time when one gets the impression that politicians actually sometimes know less, and a lot of their time is actually spent on campaigning for funds. So I think this is the problem. There was a need for this to have these think tanks, again, bridging academia and decision makers, originating from a reasonable purpose. However, I think when they grew in influence, the main problem is that they increasingly began to inform presidential administration. So, they inform Congress with policy papers. They also begin to dominate in terms of providing expert opinions to the media. they also even hire, former officials who are currently out of office, almost functioning as a waiting room. And over the years, these think tanks become more and more influential. And keep in mind, this is happening at a time when academics might be losing ground, and also print media is losing its influence as well. Meanwhile, you have this increasingly well-funded, powerful think tanks capable of producing knowledge. And if the story ended there, it could be seen as they were filling a gap. But again, if you control the production of knowledge, there's an immense power. So this is the people, again, providing information to politicians, to the media, to shape it, also not just the politicians' opinions, but also the public's opinion. So this can reach a level when, to an extent, doesn't matter who's elected if you can actually control the information they act upon. And so as these think tanks became more and more powerful, we also see that they became more and more politicized. So you have the ones on the left, you have the ones on the right. So to a large extent, the conclusions which these research centers have to investigate, they already kind of have the conclusions they want. And often some of the task is to get information to support these conclusions. And again, as these think tanks gain more and more power and influence, it begs the question, who would like to fund a think tank? Who has economic interests? When it comes to domestic policy is one thing, but if we look at foreign policy, who has economic interest in influencing foreign policy by controlling the production of knowledge? Well, I guess, obviously the arms industry would be the key candidate. And as we see, this is the one who's dominating the funding of virtually all the think tanks, very much funded by the arms industry. And again, this is what Eisenhower was warning about in '61 as well, in his farewell speech about the military-industrial complex. He had actually first referred to it in his note as the military-industrial congressional complex, but allegedly to avoid alienating Congress, he left out the congressional part. But this is, of course, I think a mistake, because this is think tanks show then how they become a key institution for how the arms industry can obtain political influence. Now, I've often seen in the media and interviews that this is almost a conspiracy theory to suggest that immense, huge industry would somehow pursue their own business interests by looking for military solutions to foreign policy questions. And I think, again, it becomes absurd, because I think what we've seen, for example, in the United States, when war tends to become the solutions to all problems, the first solution instead of the last, it's often one can trace back the information the influence to these think tanks. And for example, during the Ukraine war, look at the media who gets their advice from the think tanks. Virtually in all instances, they are always for more weapons, no negotiations. So there's a clear correlation between the knowledge or information or policy papers produced by think tanks and the interest of the ones who fund them. Again, it should be common sense. And this is the problem when you put foreign policy for sale effectively by market forces. So the ones who produce your knowledge can now effectively buy that knowledge. And it used to be more stealthy, but even leading figures within the think tank industries, which have been critical of this development, recognize that the think tanks these days, they don't even bother to uphold the solution of providing objective analysis. And same the politicians, as well as often in the media, there's a preference often for these think tankers who can provide these easy narratives, often cliches about these struggles between good versus evil, as opposed to the complexities which we often get from the academics. Also, the think tanks can be conceptualized as an excellent propaganda industry to some extent as well, because what we learn from propaganda is source credibility is key. That is, it's not what information you communicate, but it's also who communicates it. So the fact that all of this information, which is being fed to the media, fed to politicians, Congress, it all comes from this presented almost as independent institutions, academic institutions. It helps to make it seem as if this is not just marketing, but that it's actually suggesting that has actually some independent academic approach towards developing knowledge. And this over time, there has been huge recognition in media as well, how these think tanks have acquired a lot of influence. So, for example, when Obama was elected, he promised he wanted to end the Iraq War. But again, a lot of people also recognize that the CNAS, or the Center for a New American Century, had a central role in his administration. It became like the Obama's foreign policy think tank. And as the New Yorker also recognized, that due to the huge influence of CNAS in the Obama administration, was quite instrumental in order for him to effectively walk back a lot of election promises. And again, my main focus is how these think tanks are not just corrupting U.S. foreign policy by manipulating information, but also how they specifically influence policies towards Russia. Because we have to remember that the Cold War gave birth to this military-industrial complex. It's also the setting in which a lot of these think tanks came up. So this was a big business. And towards the end of the Cold War, even George Kennan, he noted, actually it's a quote, he wrote that, were the Soviet Union to sink tomorrow under the waters of the ocean, the American military-industrial complex would have to go on substantially unchanged until some other adversary could be invented. Anything else would be an acceptable shock to the American economy, because too much of the economy had been built up under the military-industrial complex, and this had been connected intrinsically into the political system. And of course, if you want to revamp or bring back militarization, who better than Russia, as this has been a key boogeyman over the years. Of course, the global war on terror, it had its day in the sun, but even the decision to expand NATO, in the 90s, I think there was more honest reporting about this, but in the 90s, from the New York Times to Washington Post, there were many reports how NATO expansion will become a bonanza for the military-industrial complex by increasing demand for American military hardware. And we see, in terms of the current conflict, for example, in Ukraine, we see how organizations such as Rand Corporation have produced these reports defined specifically how to weaken Russia by extending it. They have this chapter by chapter, how can we bleed the Russians? How can we destabilize Russia? How can we make them, promise NATO expansion, give weapons? How can this draw in the Russians so we can bleed them? How can we destabilize Belarus? How can we destabilize Central Asia? How about the Caucasus with Azerbaijan, Armenia, and essentially across the board, Syria obviously also coming in. And it's actually interesting because Rand is probably one of the most central of the think tanks. And for those who watched Stanley Kubrick's movie, Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, that's actually a satire based on the Rand Corporation. And, he has a quote, I forgot exactly what it was, but something along, it's supposed to be a satire, but this is very close to reality. It's almost a documentary how these people think. Again, this is the business of war, when that is your business model. And this is also the problem for the think tanks. They made this into a business model. They sell foreign policy, the influence of foreign policy. And the main donor, again, will always be the weapons industry. And a lot of interesting work has been done on this. We also saw during the Russiagate era, when really the hostility towards Russia really began to intensify in the United States. We saw the Brookings Institute, for example. This is where Victoria Nuland has come from. who helped, who had a central role in toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014, and continues to have a key role. Also from the Brookings Institute, one of the primary researchers of the Steele dossier, the ones who launched this whole thing, was Danchenko, was also from the Brookings Institute, Brookings Institution. In Britain also, also not immune to this. When we had this crazy reports coming out that out of the 150,000 Russians living in London, about half of them, 75,000 of them, were supposedly Russian spies. I mean, really insane stuff. This was from the Henry Jackson Institute. For those who remember the Integrity Initiative from the Institute of Statecraft, also looked at how it was another pro-democracy think tank. It was called, but again, it worked. It was funded by government intelligence agencies. It ended up setting up these cluster groups to use the journalists they trust, academics, researchers, lobbyists, think tanks, all of putting them together in order to make fake narratives and essentially create false fake knowledge, if you will. And so last example, as I think I'm running out of time, is this ISW, which is during this war now in Ukraine, the main think tank that everyone goes to cite what's happening in Ukraine. All the media goes to this same think tank. It just happens, it's treated as this legitimate institution, which is independent. But again, it's run by Kimberly Kagan and Frederick Kagan, which are these, neo-conservative influencers. This is Frederick Kagan is the brother of Robert Kagan, and Robert Kagan is also the husband of Victoria Nuland. Again, had a key role in the coup in 2014. So the fact that the husband of Victoria Nuland is the one owning or started this think tank, which is supposed to inform not just the Americans but the whole world about what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, the person who helped to topple the government, it's really obscene. But yet, this is how the creation of knowledge has been corrupted. Sorry, I thought I was going to do some more, but I think I run out of time, so I'll just cut it there.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was superb. Our next speaker of the day is Noah Krashevik. Noah is a co-director and theorist of the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist theory and political analysis. He's a working class dude and a militant in the Communist Party USA. Noah, you can start your presentation now. Where's Noah? Your camera's off, by the way. Noah, your audio's cutting out, brother. And Noah, can you hear me? We can't hear you, and I checked live. I checked on the live, and your face is also not showing up. So, if you would mind switching at least um to the general view, that would be good. Yeah, I can hear you now. No, you're past the 20-minute mark, brother. Do you mind not wrapping up, please? Thank you. No, no. Thank you, Noah. important perspective. Our next speaker is Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He has put, before that, Noah, I checked halfway through your presentation and the volume on YouTube wasn't working. So if you can try to figure that out when you get a chance, brother, please. Um, I think it's the fact that you were speaking on Zoom and had the other thing open at the same time. So if we can't figure it out, this is recorded anyways, but it would be nice if we could get that fixed. No, can you hear me? Okay. Uh, as I was mentioning, our next presenter is Gabriel Rockhill, philosopher, cultural critic, activist, founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He has published 9 books as well as numerous scholarly and journalistic articles, including most recently Counter History of the Present, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, Radical History, and the Politics of Art. And for more information, you can follow him at gabrielrockhill.com. Thank you so much for joining us, Gabriel. You can start your presentation.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks to all of the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a brief 15-minute presentation entitled The Imperial Bourgeoisie. And I'd like to begin by just highlighting the fact that there is very little reflection, I think, on the part of the PMC stratum regarding its class standing, and that there's often a deep-seated skepticism that Noah was talking about on the part of the working class regarding certain segments of the PMC. And this can often lead to certain forms of counterproductive anti-intellectualism. In my opinion, there needs to be much more self-critical analysis of class standing, as well as a broader awareness of the role of cross-class alliances in advancing the socialist cause. Personally, I'm not speaking from the point of view of someone who's unfamiliar with the working world. I'm currently a university professor and would be classified as a member of the PMC stratum within the Imperial Core, and I think that's important to highlight. At the same time, I grew up on a farm in rural Kansas doing farm labor and working construction. And then I continued to support myself throughout my studies by continuing to work construction. And so I share this information simply because in order to indicate the fact that the things that I'll be talking about are not somehow external to my own experience. And I'm deeply familiar with the life of manual labor, as well as the forms of intellectual labor undertaken by the PMC. So the professional intellectuals in the Imperial Core are generally disconnected from the struggles of working people. While this is commonly the case on the domestic front, they're even more detached from the international working class in the global South. Unsurprisingly, then, they often take political positions that are detrimental to the working and oppressed masses of the world. The phenomenon known as Western Marxism is an excellent example, as are the various forms of Western radical or critical theory. While sometimes advancing pertinent critiques of capitalism, and in particular of subjective experiences within consumer society, these traditions have more or less systematically advocated for ABS theory, anything but socialism. They've rejected every type of socialism in the real world, unless, of course, it is a form of so-called democratic socialism that is not a serious threat to capitalism, but rather a class compromise. This means that they advocate for a BS theory, because they refuse to embrace the real material solution to the problems of capitalism, which is the difficult but necessary construction of socialism. This situation has led to an understandable skepticism on the part of many workers regarding any possible positive contribution by the professional intelligentsia, or at least those ensconced within the academy, since there is often a remarkable amount of faith placed in other segments of the intelligentsia, such as journalists and pundits interviewed in the mainstream media. In a country like the United States, such skepticism, though partially justifiable, is enhanced by the deep-seated anti-intellectualism that plagues the country's culture. For those invested in a meaningful transformation of society in an egalitarian and sustainable direction, this skepticism has often led to ultra-leftist positions that consist in maintaining that workers can and should make a revolution on their own, without the pernicious influence of professional intellectuals. In many organizing circles, including political parties, this anti-intellectualism often goes hand in hand with a form of populism that fetishizes the spontaneous thoughts and actions of workers. Such a position, I will argue, is dangerous and counterproductive. In What is to be Done, Lenin clearly stated that bourgeois theorists are not only helpful to making a revolution, insofar as they are capable of providing a theoretical map of the social totality and how to transform it. They are actually necessary for revolution. And it is naive and short-sighted to rely on spontaneous workers' consciousness. Quote, this is from Lenin's What is to be Done. All those who talk about exaggerating the importance of ideology, about exaggerating the role of the conscious elements, etc., imagine that the pure and simple labor movement can work out an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers take their fate out of the hands of the leaders. This, Lenin says, is a profound mistake, end quote. The peerless leader of the Russian Revolution thereby took a categorical position that cuts directly against the grain of the ultra-leftist celebration of autonomous and spontaneous worker struggles as capable of leading directly to socialist revolution, as well as against the widespread anti-intellectualism that plagues a country like the US. There are many reasons for Lenin taking this position, but I'd like to simply highlight two. The first is that he insightfully elucidated why the spontaneous consciousness of workers tends to be trade unionism, insofar as they gravitate toward political positions that serve their personal economic interests, such as increases in wages, shorter work weeks, more benefits, and so forth. Moreover, within the imperial core, workers have often engaged in social chauvinism by ignoring the plight of workers in the colonial and semi-colonial periphery, while aligning themselves on the interests of their national bourgeoisies. This means that spontaneous workers' consciousness tends to remain within bourgeois ideology, insofar as they are trained within the capitalist system to look out for their own material interests and to preserve their position atop the imperial pyramid. Second, Lenin maintained that the power of Marxist theory consists, among other things, in the ability to move from the level of subjective experience to an objective analysis of the social totality. It is capable of explaining why the subjective ideology of workers is the result of objective social forces, if it be the subjectivism that pervades capitalist ideology or the social chauvinism that results from imperialist socio-economic relations. It can, in other words, concretely abstract from the immediacy of personal experience in order to elucidate the system of relations that produces that experience in the first place. Since spontaneous thought and action within capitalism are necessarily subordinated to bourgeois ideology, this form of objective analysis that you get in Marxist theory can contribute to the development of socialist ideology. This, very precisely, is the role of the bourgeois intelligentsia, according to Lenin, and he cites Kautsky and uses the term bourgeois intelligentsia. On the basis of profound scientific knowledge, it produces the ideology of socialism, which does not naturally or organically arise within the working class. Now, this does not mean, as Lenin clarifies in a very important footnote, that, quote, the workers have no part in creating such an ideology, end quote. But they do so not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians who are capable of acquiring the knowledge of their age and advancing that knowledge. I'd like to shift now to the question of the imperial petty bourgeoisie and the intellectual labor aristocracy. So the PMC stratum in the imperial core is not only situated above the working class domestically, it is also positioned at the apex of an international pyramid, both economically and ideologically. In the case of professional intellectuals, those intellectuals beneath them domestically or in the imperial pyramid are generally obliged to subordinate themselves to their dictates. There is thus an intellectual labor aristocracy, just like there is a manual labor aristocracy, although the former is elevated both economically and ideologically. So the intellectual labor aristocracy serves as global power brokers in the realm of ideas. To take a recent example, major figures in the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which has been a core contributor to the legacy of Western Marxism, have taken strong public positions on the question of Palestine. Jürgen Habermas and Rainer Forst co-authored with others a text entitled Principles of Sovereignty, in which they wrote, quote, despite all the concern for the fate of the Palestinian population, the standards of judgment slip completely when genocidal intentions are attributed to Israel's actions, end quote. In perfect line with the dominant ideology in the imperial core, they suggest that attributing genocidal intentions to the Israeli government would inexorably lead to anti-Semitism, as if the anti-imperialist critique of the state of Israel could only be understood through a culturalist lens as a condemnation of all Jewish people. This anti-Marxist, culturalist form of identitarian thinking means, in short, that there simply is no space for an anti-imperialist critique of the Israeli state. It is foreclosed as anti-Semitic. Moreover, the authors Habermas and Forst leave out of their discussion the patent fact that many members of the Israeli leadership have clearly and repeatedly stated their genocidal intentions, and their words have been fully backed up by their deeds. At this point, at least 17,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and about 1.9 million have been displaced, according to the UN. To put this in perspective, these numbers now surpass the 1948 Nakba, when some 15,000 people were killed and 800,000 displaced. Shayla Ben-Habib, a political science professor at Yale University, has taken a very similar position. I'm going to jump over this material in the interest of time, but she basically says that we can't look at the conflict in Palestine uniquely through a settler colonial lens, and plays the petty bourgeois card of it's more complicated, meaning it's more complicated than imperialism. And there's an excellent article by Muhammad Ali Khalidi that goes after her on this front, and also points out a number of the disingenuous mischaracterizations that are in her article. So when world famous professional intellectuals like Shayla Ben-Habib, Jürgen Habermas, and others of their ilk reprimand those critical of Israel's settler colonial project and recent genocidal assault, made possible, of course, by imperialist countries that support Israel, and especially the United States, they are exercising their power as members of the intellectual labor aristocracy to discipline those beneath them, both within their respective countries and internationally. They are also seeking to corral and control public opinion by exercising their so-called expertise, which is itself a product of the imperial intellectual apparatus that forged them as intellectuals. When they parrot the fundamental core of the dominant ideology of the US State Department, they are quite literally doing their job as imperialist ideologues who are perched atop an international hierarchy of knowledge production for a reason. So the petty bourgeois class stratum is itself notoriously unreliable and unstable. It works for and is subservient to the capitalist ruling class, and it generally promotes the dominant ideology, as I've just demonstrated briefly with the examples I highlighted. However, bereft of the power of its corporate overlords and beholden to their decisions, it often expresses resentment and frustration, and it sometimes presents itself as being on the side of the masses. One of the most common orientations of this latter group, those who feign to be on the side of workers, is petty bourgeois radicalism. It consists in proposing magical solutions to very real problems. This can take very different forms, but one of the most common is third way politics that identifies the pernicious effects of capitalism, but condemns the long and difficult road to building socialism through political parties and the seizure of state power. Instead, it proffers a quote-unquote left critique of actually existing socialism and advocates for an alternative path to overcoming capitalism, the magical third way. This form of politics can take various different forms, such as the support for an insurgent disruption of the given order by spontaneous action, the immediate establishment of a direct workers' democracy, or the messianic postulation of a transcendent idea of communism to come. Whatever the case may be, these third way proposals serve the purpose of radical recuperation. They sound radical due to their critiques of capitalism. However, since their proposed solutions are based on magical thinking, their radicality has no basis in material reality and concrete class struggles. Therefore, they actually serve to recuperate potentially radical forces within a process of capitalist accommodation. In the words of Gus Hall, quote, petty bourgeois radicalism does a very special favor to capitalism because it covers its anti-communism and anti-Sovietism with left radical phrases, end quote. Since it does not materially and concretely contribute to workers' struggles, but instead shores up the capitalist system, petty bourgeois radicalism serves first and foremost to consolidate the socioeconomic position of the professional intelligentsia within capitalism. As a form of class struggle, it struggles to maintain the class position of the professional managerial class stratum. Final concluding section is on the contradiction of intellectual life under capitalism. So to develop theory, which is a necessity, as I mentioned earlier, according to Lenin, to make a socialist revolution, you need education, support, resources, time, and so on. Within capitalism, this tends to be possible primarily within the imperial intellectual apparatus, although there are, of course, some exceptions. In order to advance within that apparatus, meaning this whole system for the production of ideas, their distribution, and their consumption, you have to play by the rules of the game, at least to a certain extent. An entire system of norms and values must be respected if you want to ascend within the extant social order. These pressures and other forces tend to breed conformism. After all, the surest way to succeed in the imperial intellectual apparatus is to invest in an imperialist theoretical practice like Jürgen Habermas and Sheila Benhabib, whose fame in the system is itself indicative of their political orientation. I would like to conclude then by indicating two tactics and one overall strategy for dealing with the following contradiction. Intellectuals are capable of providing forms of objective analysis that are necessary to revolutionary transformation of society, but within the imperial intellectual apparatus, they're trained instead to contribute to imperialism, and their career advancement largely depends on the extent of their contribution, as mediated as this contribution might be. The first tactic might be referred to as Trojan horse intellectual labor. It consists in producing the appearance of work that is palatable to the extant system in some capacity, but that actually smuggles in an alternative message or does underground anonymous work. The advantage of this tactic is that it is feasible within the given system of knowledge production, and it leverages power for those who can benefit from the time, resources, and training of the capitalist system of knowledge production. The disadvantage is that it often requires extensive sacrifices and compromises and can easily remain somewhat precarious. The second tactic, and I'm going to finish here in 2-3 minutes, Carlos. The second tactic consists in cultivating worker intellectuals who have greater freedom to do counter-hegemonic theoretical research because their livelihood is not dependent upon the imperial intellectual apparatus or because they work anonymously. One of the clearest examples in the current context is the work of Norman Finkelstein and everything that he's been doing around the most recent genocidal assault against the Palestinians. He's saying things and taking positions that are directly opposed to those of Habermas and Benhabib. If he had an academic job, he could easily lose it. However, since he was already the object of a heinous campaign that left him bereft of an academic position, this simply is not possible. There are many other examples that could be pointed to, including, of course, the work of intellectuals who never had stable university positions, like Michael Parenti, as well as those who never taught in the academy at all, such as George Jackson. It is important in this regard that counter-hegemonic intellectual work often goes hand in hand with the development of an alternative apparatus of knowledge production, circulation, and reception. Such an apparatus seeks to put power in the hands of the people rather than the ownership class, thereby democratizing intellectual labor and learning. I take it that all of the three organizations that have co-sponsored this event are, in different ways, with various objectives and with very limited resources, attempting to do something along these lines. The more resources that can be leveraged in this direction, the more opportunities there will be to support the work of intellectual workers who are not ensconced in the bourgeois academy. Final words, both of these tactics can put intellectuals in the service of the socialist cause. However, the overall strategy needs to be the building of a socialist intellectual apparatus in which the educational system functions of, by, and for the people. This is not an easy task, and the establishment of a socialist country does not magically bring this about. Struggles continue after revolutions, of course, to further develop, perfect, and democratize systems of intellectual production, circulation, and reception. This can be a very long and difficult process, but it must remain the horizon of our work. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Since I'm doing the moderating, I'll omit the introduction of myself since I did that at the beginning. But I think the way you end your presentation is a really nice segue into some of the themes that I want to touch on. The question we are exploring today concerning the divorce of intellectuals in the working class is fundamental for assessing the crisis we face and the subjective conditions for revolution. The first thing I think must be interrogated is what is presupposed in the formulation of the problem in such manner. When we say that there has been a split, a schism between intellectuals and the working class, there's a specific type of intellectual that we have in mind. The grand majority of intellectuals, especially within the capitalist mode of life, have had their lots tied to the dominant social system. They have functioned as a necessary component of the dominant order. Those who take the ideals of the bourgeoisie, the class enemy of most of humanity, and embellish them in language which opens the narrow interests of the ruling class to the consenting approval of contending classes. In the same manner, Marx describes the bourgeoisie as the personified agents of capital. The intellectuals have been the personified agents of capitalist ideology. They are tasked, as Gramsci taught us, with making the dispersed and unpopular bourgeois assumptions into a coherent and appealing outlook, one people are socialized into accepting as reality itself. Intellectuals have always, in a certain sense, been those groups of people that light the fire and move the statues which the slaves in the caves see as cave shadows embodying reality itself. These intellectuals, the traditional intellectuals, are of course not the ones we have in mind when we speak of a schism between intellectuals and workers. We are speaking instead of those who have been historically able to see the movement of history, to make splits within bourgeois worldviews, and who have subsequently thrown their lots in with the proletariat and popular classes, those forces which present the kernel for the next, more human, more democratic mode of life. Marx and Engels had already noted that there is always a section of bourgeois ideologists that raise themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole and cut themselves adrift to join the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. We're talking about the Du Boises, the Apthekers, the Marinelos in the case of Cuba, the Parentis, and others who, while coming out of the institutions of the bourgeois academy, would align their interests with working and oppressed peoples. They would become the theoreticians, the historians, the poets, which gave the working class movements various forms of clarity in their struggles for power. What has happened to this section of intellectuals and its relationship with working people? Have they lost their thirst for freedom? Has their capacity for trembling with indignation, as Che would say, at the injustices waged on working and oppressed people suddenly dissipated? It is important to note that any attempt to answer this question in this short time span will always, by necessity, leave important aspects of the conversation out. I would love here to speak at length about the campaigns of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the formation of a fake anti-communist left, and the role imperialist state departments, bourgeois foundations, and other such outfits had in creating a left intelligentsia divorced from the real movements of working people, both within the imperial core and in the periphery. I know my colleagues here have been paying much more due attention to these monumental components of answering the question we have before us. However, I'd like to instead focus on the practice of intellectuals, on the expectations and requirements set by the academy itself, which have already baked into its very structure the divorce of radical intellectuals from the struggles and movements of working and oppressed peoples. The first thing that must be noted is the following. We cannot simply treat this problem as one rooted in the intellectuals as a class, nor as one rooted in the subjective deficiencies of particular intellectuals. The Marxist worldview requires us to examine the system, the social totality that produces such a split. We are tasked with exploring the political economy of knowledge production, if you will, which structures the relations of its mental workers through forms which insularize them to the structures and needs of the academy. As Gabriel Rockhill would say, it is a political economy of knowledge that systematically reproduces radical recuperators, compatible lefts, and pseudo-radical purity fetish outlooks that play an indispensable role in the reproduction of our moribund capitalist imperialist system. From the moment prospective radical scholars enter graduate school, they are integrated into this system. Their lofty hopes of being active participants as intellectuals in a class struggle are castrated by the demands the academy makes upon them qua scholars. They're told that their writing should take a distinctively academic tone, that popular vernacular is frowned upon, that hyperreferentiality, the practice of citing all the intellectual gods in the cosmos who have commented on a topic, is a good sign, is a sign of good work and of proper scholarship. Truth and the struggle for human freedom are at best given a back seat, and that is if they're in the vehicle at all. Young scholars, in the incubators of their careers, are already indoctrinated in the aristocratic dogmas of writing for a select group of elite scholars, worshiping journal impact factors, and condescendingly dismissing those who use their intellectual capacities to work for the people. Actually, in proper Socratic fashion, engage in the radical quest for truth, those who seek to properly understand the world in order to work with the masses of humanity to change it. Young scholars, burdened by tens of thousands of dollars accumulated in undergraduate studies debts, are told that even with a PhD, they will have an extremely difficult time finding a job, at least one suitable for continued academic work that pays sufficiently enough to pay back the accumulated debt. They are told, specifically those with radical sensibilities, that they should focus on joining academic associations, network with people in their fields, familiarize themselves with the work published in leading journals so that they too, one day, can join the publication hamster wheel aimed at advancing these slaves through the tenure ladder. They are told that they must not waste their time writing for popular audiences, that doing broadcast and media work that reaches infinitely more people than the readers of ridiculously paywalled journals or university editorials is a waste of time. Every attempt at rooting their scholarship in the people, in the real movements of our day, is shot down. The gurus mediating their initiation into the academic capitalist cult ask, do you know how this sort of work will look on your resume to the hiring committees? Do you think scholars in charge of your tenure advancement will appreciate your popular articles for Countercurrents, your books from Monthly Review, your articles in low impact factor or impact factorless journals? At every turn, your attempts to commit yourself to the Socratic pursuit of truth, to playing a role in changing the world, is condemned as sinful to the gods of resume evaluation. They say, do you not want to finish your degree with the potential of of obtaining gainful employment? Do you want to be condemned to adjunct professorialship, to teaching 7 classes for half the pay of the full professors who teach 3? Do you want to condemn your family to debt slavery for the decades to come simply because you did not want to join our very special and elite publication hamster wheel? After all, who wouldn't want to spend months writing an article to send it into a journal that will reply in a year telling you, if you're amongst the lucky ones, that it has been accepted with revisions rooted in the specific biases of the arbitrary reviewers? Doesn't that sound fun? Isn't this what philosophy and the humanities in general is all about? Eventually, material pressures themselves break the spirit of young visionary scholars. Reproletarianized and unable to survive on teaching assistantships, they resign themselves to the hamster wheel with hopes of one day living the comfortable lives of their professors. Their radical sensibilities, however, are still there. They need an outlet. They look around and find that the academic hamster wheel has pockets of radicals writing edgy things for decently rated journals. They quickly find their kin, those who reduce radical politics to social transgressiveness, those who are concerned more with dissecting concepts like epistemic violence than with the violence of imperialism. Here it is, the young scholar thinks, a place where I can pad my resume and absolve myself of the guilt weighing down on my shoulders, a guilt rooted in the recognition, deep down, that one has betrayed the struggles for humanity, that one has become an agent of the forces they originally desired to fight against. Their existence, their lives, will always be rooted in what Sartre called bad faith. Self-deception becomes their norm. They are now the radical ones, the enlightened ones in issues of language. The working class has become a backwards rabble they must educate, and that if they come near them at all. What hope could there be in this group of deplorables? Sure, American capitalism could be criticized, but at least we're enlightened. We're woke to LGBTQ issues and other issues. But those Russians, Chinese, Venezuelans, Iranians, etc., aren't they backwards? What are their thoughts on trans issues? Should we not, in the interest of our enlightened civilization, support our government's efforts to civilize them? Let's go take them some of our valued democracy and human rights. I'm sure their people will appreciate it very much. I have presented the stories which are all too familiar to those of us still working within the academy. It is evident, in my view at least, that the divorce of radical intellectuals from working class people and their movements has been an institutionalized effort of the capitalist elite. This division is embedded, it is implied in the process of intellectuals becoming what the system requires of them for their own survival. The relations they occupy in the process of knowledge production presupposes their split with working people. This rigidity of academic life has intensified over the last century. Yes, we do have plenty of past cases of radical academics, those who have sided with the people, being kicked to the curb by their academic institutions. But where have they landed and why? Doesn't a blackballed Du Bois get to teach at the Communist Party's Jefferson School? Doesn't Herbert Aptheker, following his expulsion from the academy, obtain a position as the full-time editor-in-chief of the Communist Party's theoretical journal, Political Affairs? Besides the aforementioned, what other factors make our day different from, say, 1950s US? The answer is simple. What counter-hegemonic popular institutions we had were destroyed, in part by the efforts of our government, in part by the collapse or the overthrow of the Soviet bloc. Although some, like ourselves, are currently in the process of attempting to construct them, today we have nowhere near the material and financial conditions we had in the past. The funding and aid the Soviets provided American communists is, unfortunately, not something provided for us by the dominant socialist states of our era. Ideology does not exist in a transcendental realm. It is embodied materially through people and institutions. Without the institutions that can ensure that radical scholars are not forced to tiptoe the line of the bourgeois academy, the material conditions for the split will be sustained. If I may, I would like to end with the following point. It is very easy to condemn the so-called radical academics we find in the bourgeois hamster wheel divorced from the people and their struggles. While condemnation might sometimes be justified, I think pity is the correct reaction. They are subjects of a tragedy. As Hegel notes, the essence of tragedy is found in the contradictions at play between the various roles an individual occupies. Sophocles' Antigone is perhaps the best example. Here, a sister, Antigone, is torn between the duty she has to bury her brother, Polynices, and the duty she has as a citizen to follow King Creon's decree, which considers Polynices a traitor undeserving of a formal burial. This contradiction is depicted nicely in Hegel's work, who says that both are in the wrong because they are one-sided, but both are also in the right. Our so-called radical intelligentsia is, likewise, caught in the contradiction of the two roles they wish to occupy, one as revolutionary and the other as academic. Within the confines of the existing institutions, there could be no consistent reconciliation of the duties implied in each role. This is the setup of a classical tragedy, one which takes various forms with each individual scholar. It is also, as Socrates reminds Aristophanes and Agathon at the end of Plato's Symposium, a comedy, since the true artist in tragedy is an artist in comedy also. The tragic and simultaneous comedic position occupied by the radical intelligentsia can only be overcome with the development of popular counter-hegemonic institutions, such as parties and educational institutes akin to those sponsoring today's panel. It is only here where scholars can embed themselves in the people. However, scholars are humans living under capitalism. They need, just like everyone else, to have the capacity to pay for their basic subsistence. These institutions, therefore, must work to develop the capacity of financially supporting both the intellectual traders to the traditional bourgeois academy and the organic intellectuals emerging from the working class itself. That is, I think, one of the central tasks facing those attempting to bridge the divide we have convened to examine today. Thank you. That's all for my presentation. The next presenter is Radhika Desai, who is a professor at the Department of Political Science, of Political Studies, excuse me. She is director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada. She is the convener of the International Manifesto Group. Her books include Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy, which I have just back there. It's an excellent book. Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire from 2013, Slouching Towards Ayodhya, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, from Congress to Hindutva in Indian politics, and Intellectuals in Socialism, Social Democrats and the Labor Party from 1994, a New Statesman and Society book of the month. So thank you so much for joining us, Radhika, and you may begin your presentation.
Thanks very much, Carlos. I'm hoping very much that my internet connection holds up, and I would like to share my screen. And if that doesn't work, then I will stop sharing my screen. I will stop my video, give you a lecture, but let me try the sharing of the screen first. So I hope everybody will be able to see this. Carlos, please just let me know if my, video and audio are failing, etc. So, as Carlos said, what Carlos ended with actually is also a good segue into my presentation. I'm very enthused about this webinar, this panel, because it really, for me, the contemporary concerns, but also concerns that I especially cut my intellectual teeth on intellectual life. So the socialism is, of course, the title of my book. And I basically saw by the 1980s, not only an end of not the end of a long cycle of working class activism and a sort of great achievement, at least in the Western working class in terms of the welfare state, etc., but also finally the exhaustion of that model. And what I argued is that this end of a period in the history or chapter in the history of socialism is also an end of the chapter in the relationship between intellectuals and socialism. And as some others have also pointed out, the question then is, are we also going to see the beginning of a new type of relationship? So let me see how this. Yes. So before my first book, so my MA is about right think tanks. So relating right directly to what Glenn talked about. Indeed, in my as far as I know, the work I did in the mid-1980s, although it wasn't published until the early 90s, but this systematic study of the think tanks phenomena, which was and socialism, and finally, understanding these things has been further people attempt to try to understand how the people who call themselves Marxists are actually denaturing the understanding of Marx. And this has to do with many of the trends that various people talk about, that I want to talk about. So this is some of the things that and I also speak from other experiences. I've been long in understanding in a materialist basis. Quite frankly, understanding it in any other way absolutely makes no sense. I also come from a background, I was born and brought up in India. I did my first degree there. And for me, the success of the dirigiste phase, the phase of planned development of the early decades of Indian independence were absolutely critical. And of course, the turn away from that have been absolutely disastrous for India. And the influence of Soviet, and sorry, I meant to say Chinese communism was very important there. I've also done a lot of work on material content of nationalisms and how that changed the nature of nationalism and nationalist thinking changed with the neoliberalism. So this is where I'm coming from. But I also want to add that nothing I say here is definitive. I'm going to recall some of the things I've said and in earlier works and how they take some great concern, but I really think that the field is wide open for a deep discussion of these things, and that's why I've been so enthusiastic about this webinar. So broadly speaking, I want to go back to the theoretical framework in which I tried to understand intellectual life and politics, and particularly the relation between the working class and intellectuals, that through the framework of Gramscian understandings. Then I will quickly bring it to how these things began to change in the 1970s, what are its political repercussions, and the situation today. So let's get down to some brass tacks. Basically, Gramsci was known talking
Radhika, the audio keeps coming in and out. It'll be good for 30 seconds and then it'll
turn my video off. Okay, I'm going to turn my video off and then let me know if it works. Okay.
Sounds good.
Is that all right? So
yes, if that ends up not working, I was also thinking that you could do the screen sharing with the computer and hop on through the phone or something. The signal is usually better on the phone in most cases, but let's see if without the.
Okay, I don't know who I would phone though. Anyway, sorry, I'm not equipped to do that on the phone. So if it doesn't work, I'll just have to stop screen sharing. But let's hope this works. So what I was trying to say is that Gramsci's analysis, his analysis of hegemony, is generally focused on in terms of essentially what I call the consent-generating function of hegemony. But very few people focus on what I see as the directive function of hegemony. That is to say, any hegemonic ideology has to give the ruling class, whether it be the bourgeoisie or the proletariat or what have you, a conception of what they are doing, what they are up to, what they need to be doing, what is the larger picture within which they are working, etc. So Gramsci, that is partly why Gramsci devoted a lot of his writing to the role of intellectuals. So intellectuals are absolutely central in his concept of hegemony and political change. So if we look at Gramsci points out that the exploration and refinement of the concept of the unity of theory and practice is still only at an early stage. And of course, this whole issue of the relationship between theory and practice is absolutely critical, and that is why we end up thinking about exactly the relatively elite status of intellectuals and their problematic with the working class, etc., but some relationship has to exist. So Gramsci continues, people speak about a theory as a complement or accessory to practice, or as a handmaid of practice. It would seem right for this question too to be considered historically as an aspect of the political question of intellectuals. Critical self-consciousness means, historically and politically, the creation of an elite of intellectuals, and Gramsci emphasizes elite. The human mass does not distinguish itself, does not become independent in its own right without, in this sense, organizing itself. There is no organization without intellectuals, organizers and leaders. In other words, without the theoretical aspect of the theory-practice nexus being distinguished concretely by the existence of a group of specialized in conceptual and in conceptual and philosophical elaboration of ideas. So what also is saying here, remember, for those of you who know his work on intellectuals, he does not think intellectuals are necessarily particularly smart people. He emphasizes that intellectuals are those who have the social role of intellectuals. They're supposed to be performing the role of a direct giving overall conception of what is to be done, and so on. They may do it very badly. They may be very dumb people. So the issue smartness versus dumbness. The question is whether they have the social role of doing that or not. Now, Gramsci also distinguishes between two types of intellectuals. One he calls traditional intellectuals and another organic intellectuals. And let me also say that the very idea of organic intellectuals I consider to be a programmatic idea. That is to say, Gramsci talks a lot about it, has much to say about it. At the same time, it is not clear that this idea has been fully realized. It would be good if it were realized. Gabriel ended on a note which seemed to suggest that he was essentially saying, let's make organic intellectuals. And I would agree with him. But at the time that Gramsci was writing, he was very aware that this was so. So for traditional intellect, and this is me and Gramsci, I'm paraphrasing Gramsci and I'm also quoting Gramsci. So in terms of traditional intellectuals, what Gramsci says is that in a capital, intellectuals under the label traditional include the noblesse de robe, a stratum of administrators, scholars and scientists, non-ecclesiastical philosophers, etc., who have replaced the ecclesiastical intellectuals of feudal society as secular organizers of culture in modern capitalist society. The traditional intellectual lacked the organic intellectual's rootedness in the latent aspirations and development of the real force of life. If this deracination infected their role with a certain abstracted elitism and idealism, in contrast to the initially partial and specialized character of organic intellectuals, these independent intellectuals elaborated larger and universal visions of order. So what Gramsci is doing is he's saying that Traditional intellectuals may be deracinated, organic intellectuals may be rooted, but at the same time, organic intellectuals tend to focus on specific aspects of life, whereas traditional intellectuals may more focusing vision. Now, so that's traditional intellectuals, what organic intellectuals. So Gramsci says every social group, upon coming into existence on the original terrain of an essential function in the world of economic production, which is to say a class, creates together with itself organically one or more strata of intellectuals which give it homogeneity and an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic, but also in the social and political fields. The capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizers of a new culture, of a new legal system, etc. So this is so both bourgeoisie and proletariat would have organic intellectuals of their own classes. So this much is clear. But not only does Gramsci not say what the working class creates, whether the working class creates, he says capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself all these things, but he does not go on to what the working class creates as it comes into existence. And not only does he say that, he further adds that initially at least, these organic intellectuals are, for the most part, specializations of partial aspects of the primitive activity of the new social type, which the new social class has brought into prominence. And he adds further that organic intellectuals, while distinctive in that they participate in the technical labor process, must also become capable of articulating wider concerns, political and directive. From technique as work, one proceeds to technique as science, and to the humanist conception of history without which one remains specialized and does not become directive, that is to say specialized and political. So given these requirements, Gramsci is very conscious that this has made it very difficult for working class parties and movements to be led by working class organic intellectuals. Indeed, Gramsci says further that the struggle for socialism requires presumably the working class or the organic intellectuals of the working class to engage in a conquest of the traditional intellectuals. So he says traditional intellectuals, with their participation in the tradition of systematic intellectual activity, also figure centrally in any struggle for hegemony. In that, and these, those were my words, but these are now Gramsci's words, in that any group that is developing towards dominance struggles to assimilate and conquer them ideologically. Unquote. Competing visions of social order to be overcome in any struggle for hegemony. For Gramsci, it would be true to say that a socialist worldview, while it must ideally become organically attached and committed to the culture of the working class, was also a critical development of the existing traditional intellectual culture. And it's also very interesting that when you read Gramsci, Gramsci does not think that the working class is going to spontaneously create a separate and opposing and superior culture. For Gramsci, the working class must assimilate, critically of course, but must assimilate the heights of the culture that the bourgeoisie have created. So this is quite interesting. And again, I'm not saying this is absolutely right. What I'm saying is this is what Gramsci says. So to me, the ubiquity of traditional intellectuals in working class politics from Marx and Engels onwards, up to the crisis of that entire cycle of working class politics in the 1970s, something noted. And what we have seen since then, and in many ways, what many of the previous speakers have pointed to, is the breakdown of that role. Because what you had up to that point, is a situation in which on one hand there was a certain bifurcation of intellectual life but the word bifurcation does not just a small number of people who could be even counted as intellectuals of the right, but a relatively large number of people who tended to be intellectuals of the critical currents of society, initially liberalism in the 19th and late 19th and early 20th century, some or the other version of working class politics. Of course, the role these people played, and they were predominantly traditional intellectuals, the role they played de-radicalized socialism and also reconciled it with imperialism. There is no doubt about this, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer session. And of course, it also led to they were also part, insofar as we're talking about Western countries, as Perry Anderson notes in his Western Marxism, writings on Western Marxism, that it was a product of defeat. So therefore, in some ways, this radicalization and the compromise with imperialism were written into it. But anyway, this is the framework with which I approached my study. Something very some very major changes began to take place. So first of all, we witnessed beginnings of marginalization and decline of traditional intellectuals. So, for example, when I did my study of on the think tanks and Thatcherism, what was very clear is that Mrs. Thatcher and her think tanks were actually a sort of the dominant Keynesian consensus from the outside. Anyway, undermining the consensus that had created. So this was done by me. Most academic people may not remember this, but at one point, some 300 plus, if I remember the name correctly, actually signed a letter opposing Mrs. Thatcher's economic policies. So that is one sense in which we have seen the marginalization of traditional intellectuals in the sense of people who had universities of life, and that is also being seen increasingly in academic life, becoming more and more narrow, specialized, and in fact irrelevant. Of course, then we have the ascendancy of neoliberalism.
Radhika?
I think from here, I won't share my screen because it's just letters. So I will just give my lecture, and hopefully this will be okay. So basically, what you see is the ascendancy of neoliberalism, which I'm also very aware that neoliberalism essentially is a completely, shall we say, the opposite of what intellectuals should do, that is study reality, understand it, etc. Neoliberal is a commitment to certain axiomatic principles from which you are not supposed to deviate. And so in that sense, the ascendance of neoliberalism itself intrinsically marks a decline in intellectual life. It is the ultimate in what Marx used to call autonomy. So it is essentially an intellectually bankrupt attempt to legitimize capitalism when it had arrived at the point already in the late 19th century when neoclassical economics emerges, which is essentially neoliberalism. You already have capitalism arriving at its monopoly phase, and neoliberalism and neoclassical economics have spent the last 150 odd years essentially trying to evade the reality that capitalism has already entered its monopoly phase. It has actually never hegemonized the whole of society. Its reach is shallow, and so in a certain sense, the real problem that we have in our time, which I'll come to in a minute, is that not that neoliberalism swept all before it, convinced everybody that it was right. On the contrary, it did very little of that. But what we have is a situation in which the intellectuals, that the political leaders and intellectuals, the left of center parties essentially capitulated to neoliberalism, leaving the vast number of discontents of neoliberalism with very little political representation, which has then led to political disaffection, what one political scientist called ruling the void. That is to say, it has let the ruling classes of Western capitalists ruling over a void, because basically there is, the people aren't actually there, and that's partly why, of course, populist currents like Trump and Brexit, etc., tend to get the space that they do. And of course, it has very little effective directive capacity in the face of mounting contradictions of capitalism. So neoliberalism is still the ruling ideology, but it is less and less capable of what the ruling classes should do. Another element of the change in intellectual life has been, of course, the passage to postmodernism, the attack on grand narratives, which I also take to be the inevitable degeneration of intellectual life, which is a result of the fateful, what I call the social scientific division of labor, which was inaugurated more or less as soon as neoclassical economics emerged, because neoclassical economics said there is something called the economy, which we must study with something called economics, and therefore there are other spheres of society that are relatively autonomous. Of course, a complete departure from the historical and political economy understanding of society that prevailed up to that point and found its culmination in Marx and Engels. So in that sense, this was bound to happen. There is, of course, a shift, as many people have mentioned, to culturalism, which goes hand in hand with a generalized acceptance of the neoclassical and neoliberal view of the economy. This has oddly enough gone hand in hand from a situation in which some people, used to call the underproduction of intellectuals to the overproduction of intellectuals, that is to say, educated classes, to such an extent that today we speak not intellectuals, but an entire class or a stratum of managerial classes, educated people who are essentially class today. And this, when I was writing my intellectual social was completed essentially in the late 1980s, early 90s. I noted that there was already an interesting study called The Rise of Professional Society work, in which there is a new bifurcation of intellectual life in which the main cleavage runs between those who are employed in private and profit-oriented sectors, the right-wing intellectuals, right. Sorry, I'm back again. So on the one hand, those who are employed in the private sector, who are essentially in the sort of the right, and those who are, in his words, working in the non-profit making institutions, such as universities, charitable foundations, and in the public sector. The interesting thing, however, is that what we have seen since then, that is, since the late 80s, early 90s, is that in fact the left of center parties and intellectuals have themselves capitulated to neoliberalism, instead of the situation in which, as it seemed for a while in the 1970s, that if the right is going to move further to the right, then the left will move further to the left. Instead, what we saw is the defeat of those currents which were arguing for a move to the left, So, and this defeat was essentially carried out by the leaders of the left of center parties, and as a consequence, what you have is a situation in which I move to the right and the left also move to the right. Essentially, so that asserts what you can say is that the very intellectual or professional managerial classes now became dominant in the left of center parties as well as in the right of center parties. Both sorts of parties are now dominated by members of the professional middle class, whether they're doctors, whether they're qualified professionals, teachers. All of these people are now acting as a class and endorsing neoliberalism as basically being, not obviously not saying it explicitly, but they are serves their class interests. So, and then also further, so far as there is the left to the left of the Blairites and the Clintonites and so on, what you witness there is the emergence of what I call a neoliberalism of the left itself, which is in which basically, and this will resonate with things that Gabriel was saying, they combine and Noah as well, a form of Proudhonist economics with what I call network politics. So basically no critique of capitalism and no insistence on planning and party. And of course, we have seen rise of populism, culture wars, etc., rhetorical polarization replacing the absence of genuine polarization in political life. There is also further a descent of political discourse into barely disguised justification for the pursuit of the increasingly incoherent interests of financialized corporate classes. So in a certain sense, we have actually no serious intellectual life. And the divide between the professional middle class, who are in those ranks of calling that, but they're very appropriate of what these people are up to. So these people have absolutely nothing with ordinary working class people within the imperialist core, and moreover, they are also increasingly dissociated with what's going on in the third world, because the patterns of migration are such that there is essentially the professional middle classes are themselves concentrating themselves in the imperial core itself. And I think that is the really interesting aspect that we should study. So in conclusion, I will simply say that, of course, now what are the possibilities of change? So one possibility is whether neoliberal financialized capitalism will it end up alienating the professional middle classes, as it seems to be in the process of alienating small and medium-sized capital, which is increasingly happening. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, will working people organize themselves? This is the one that Gabriel was invoking. Will working people organize themselves organically by finally producing their own organic intellectuals who can also hegemonize the rest of the professional middle class? So with that, I will end. Thank you. Sorry about my full internet.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Radhika. And with that, we conclude the presentation section of an event that I think covers a paramount question for progressive forces today. And with that, we can go into the next section of today's events, which is questions from the audience. I don't know how long we want to go. We can take it to the end of the hour. We can add maybe 10 minutes past noon Central Time here, or what do you think, Radhika? How long should we go with questions?
What do you have?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. The signal call.
Let's see what questions people have.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, please, if you can, use the little reaction buttons. I see that Noah has his hand up, so I'll call on him. But for folks with questions, at the bottom of the Zoom, you'll see a little option that says reactions. Just click anything. You don't have to click the hand up, but click whatever you want. That'll notify me, and then I'll be able to call on you. But Noah, you had a question. Yeah, and I saw we also received a couple financial contributions from there from Dino and Cobra Commander. So thank you to those who have contributed financially. David, you're muted, David.
Yeah,
There you go.
that's hi. I can't afford to go to a dentist. I don't get health care. That's only for the rich, the affluent, you know. So I'm left out of the capitalist system, you know.
Absolutely, that's the condition most of us here in the States are in. The heart of the belly of the beast, the heart of contemporary imperialism. But most of us can't go check our teeth, our eyesight, or other things. Um, was that just a comment, or did you have a question along with that? Because now we can move over to
But
Radhika.
not just a comment, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, David.
Yeah.
Radhika, I, I, I guess so. Yeah, go ahead. Radhika? Are you muted still?
I just had a couple of questions. One is a general question, but it arises from Glenn's point, but it also relates to many of the things, things that other people were saying. But can we say that think tanks produce knowledge, or should we say something else? I mean, are we using knowledge in a technical sense or in a more substantial sense? And my second question was just a clarification, Glenn. You were talking about the military-industrial complex and its contribution to the U.S. economy, and I just wondered if you have better, if you have a more elaborate measurements of it than simply the knowledge that we can have, which anybody can get from Wikipedia, that the US spends around 1 trillion a year on its economy, which is out of a 20 trillion GDP, roughly speaking, so it's about 5% of GDP, but that does not seem to be quite big enough, or I don't know, maybe you can comment on that. That's it for now. Thank you.
Well, in terms of the numbers, this is part of the problems for the people who was looking into the think tanks, because they don't necessarily report on all the numbers. It's just what they do report on makes it abundantly clear that the arms manufacturers are the main financiers of pretty much all of them. Of this think tank. So it is quite remarkable in terms of what it translates into. So, for example, I focused a lot on how the think tanks provides, the information for government, as well as to put in the media to mobilize public support. But it's also quite remarkable how they actually almost buy off politicians. If you look at the political leaders, the ones in pretty much every administration in the United States, pretty much all of them are affiliated with think tanks. This is the revolving door. This is whenever they're out of office, that's where they get hired for their expertise, and then when they get back in, they're pretty much still on the payroll. So I'm not sure if I understood the question right in terms of creating knowledge. Whether or not it's disinformation or knowledge. Yes, that's a different concept would almost have to be used, because in academia we say, the purpose of academia is the creation of knowledge, but it's not what they're doing. It's not the pursuit of truth. It's a business. So they are producing that's a good point. We can't really use knowledge, can we? But producing, information or fake information required to push specific policies. And it's not with the knowledge I would think that the maximizing security would have the central focus. But of course, that's not what this is about. This is about driving profit margins. So I'm not sure if I missed the question there, but yeah.
Not at all. In fact, I just remembered that I often say that people talk about fake news, but very few people talk about fake scholarship, which is kind of what's happening a lot right now, exactly by the mechanisms that you mentioned. So,
fake scholarship, yeah. No, I think should have used that term. I like it a lot more already. Thanks.
Thank you all for the question and the response. I think this gets at a topic that we might consider doing another panel on, which is ideology. Some of the central debates have been between the neutral functionalist understanding and the epistemologically laden question of false consciousness and all these other things. And the scholarship likes to separate whether one has to take one approach or the other. I tend to think you can reconcile both. We have a couple hands up. I see David. I don't know if that's the lingering hand from last time, or is that a new hand that went up? And I also see Noah. I know that Noah brought the hand up as well. So I guess Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question from our YouTube live. Jimmy Shoot asks, how can communists prevent an influx of opportunistic intellectuals to the party as soon as it gets into power? And I'd like to briefly comment on this if I could. this is actually something the Bolsheviks experienced historically. And the way that they dealt with it led to quite a lot of problems, right? We had the purges. They were in a very bad place and a very bad time. But right now, where we are, we already have these opportunists within these organizations. We already have this within the left movement in general. And so I think the solution for us is getting everyone, and I mean everyone, not just intellectuals, but every working class person and that comes in to at least understand the very basics of Marxism, right? To be able to understand the world dialectically, to ascend to the concrete. If we all at least come from this point of view, then the opportunists are very clearly seen as soon as they come around, coming from a different point of view, right? In our age of post COINTELPRO and the sophistication of surveillance and the ruling class, there's no other solution. The notion that we could keep an organization infiltration free, I think, is laughable. As soon as it gets powerful enough to be embraced by the masses, it will already be infiltrated. But that education, that very basics for everybody, and this is one of the actual things I was going to end my whole presentation with, is not only the reconnection of radical intellectuals and working people, but the relationship that is necessary for us to move forward.
Thank you. Of the panelists, anyone want to address Jimmy Schute's question? I see a couple hands up. Radhika, I don't know if yours was to answer that or a new question.
I've raised my hand because Alan has a question. So whenever you're ready for Alan's question.
Oh, okay. Well, Gabriel, I think you raised it right after Jimmy's question. Do you want to address that one?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And it is true that historically, all of the actually existing socialist states have had to deal with a fundamental problem. And that problem I would describe as the kind of dialectics of socialism. You need to develop the productive forces in order to not be crushed by the imperialist powers. In order to do that, you need to rely on the expertise of the intelligentsia. And often, historically, depending on the country that we're talking about, the intelligentsia has been, subjected to various forms of opportunism and tending to pitch to empire because that's how you have the best career opportunities. And so how do you resolve that contradiction of the need of expertise and intellectuals while knowing full well that the intelligentsia has often historically pitched to empire? And I think there are a number of different, historical examples that we could look into, but I'll just highlight one because I think that it did this relatively successfully. If you're familiar with Fidel Castro's words to intellectuals, one of the things that he did is he outlined the important fact that those who are diehard revolutionaries are already part of the cause. Like, we don't have to worry about them, they're going to contribute. Those who are on the fence, which are the overwhelming majority of the intellectuals in the Cuban case, at least as far as Castro described it, are the ones who are wavering, and they could go either way. And then there's the hardcore anti-revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries that obviously we have to wage war against. And so his famous claim that, dentro de la revolución todo, contra la revolución nada. So within the revolution, everything. Meaning even those petty bourgeois intellectuals who are on the fence, we need them, we need to work with them, we need to convince them that the cause is worth fighting for. And it's only the real counter-revolutionaries that we need to wage war against. This is a difficult and very complicated procedure, but I think it adds something to the discussion that we've had thus far, because I think a lot of us are speaking from our own context, of course, which tend to be the imperial core, but within actually existing socialism, and I would say even within the imperial core, we do also need to insist on the struggle to bring people into the struggle who are basically sitting on the fence, or in the words that Carlos used earlier, they're the kind of radical intelligentsia that want to appear radical but aren't. We also have to, just as Lenin said, we have to wage our struggles against every class stratum. And we actually have to bring those people into the struggle and convince them to be on our side, because our side is the winning side.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The ruling class can only survive on the basis of divide and conquer, and we have to counter that with various forms of unity across different popular classes, contending classes to the ruling elite. No, I saw you raise your hand. Was it to answer the question or a new question? Because if not, we'll go to Radhika.
Get all the answers first. Every time I raise my hand, it will be for a question from the live stream.
Okay.
Yeah.
Radhika, we can proceed. You mentioned it was Alan's question. So yeah.
Alan is going to ask his question.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
My question is a kind of category question, but I'm going to start by putting two very evocative issues. But was the Soviet bureaucracy composed of intellectuals? Right. Two, is Keir Starmer an organic intellectual? Right. This is why, because all these people were in the generic sense intellectuals, right? Now, the Marxist movement had a couple of categories which it used to use to describe people who we would now talk about as intellectuals. One was middle class, which is not really a Marxist term, but are intellectuals inherently middle class? That would be sort of question number one, right? Working class could be organic in the sense that you come out of the working class, but can it also be organic in the sense that that's what you do? I think teachers are working class because that's what they do, right? Now, the second question then is, are they petty bourgeois? Because in Marx's time, and he refers to the 1920s, always speaks of the petty bourgeoisie as the class that the fascists attract, but it's kind of conventional, but not very useful in the move I was involved in, which were Trotskyists, to kind of lump together shopkeepers and teachers. And, they're all petty bourgeois, right? I don't find that useful. So are intellectuals petty bourgeois? If not, what is petty bourgeois? It's clear that we don't live in a society in which the petty bourgeoisie are all shopkeepers, much as I love shopkeepers. But if so, who are the petty bourgeoisie? Is the term useful at all? And, finally, this ties together the function of the state bureaucracy. Surely what intellectuals of the wrong sort, what intellectuals do is they run bureaucracies, right? Well, are there good bureaucracies and are there bad bureaucracies?
Thank you so much for that question, Alan. Very important question. Do we have any answers? Noah, do you want to address that one?
I'd love to argue with Alan a little bit here. Alan, I love you, but I think middle class is a Marxist term. I think it's a term Marx and Engels used quite a bit. In 18th Brumaire, Marx speaks of the bourgeoisie originally developing as a middle class, and he speaks about the ideological problems that brings with it, such as the inability to recognize themselves as part of an entire class structure and seeing themselves as above class antagonism. But I think the problem is the way we're trained to think of middle class is not Marxist, right? So what would a middle class be for Marxism, which is really the essential content of what Alan is saying, right? And that would be anything that stands somewhere between the ruling class and the class it's in contradiction with, right? Just somewhere between it. That's all you got to be. So the PMC would be this, right? Engels speaks of bourgeoisification in all of his talk about the conditions of the working class in England, right? And he actually comments that when people start owning homes, they're no longer within the proletariat. So what are they in this case, right? They're clearly not a shopkeeper, like Ellen is saying, but they are within a middle class. And it's funny because this is where all my study recently has been directed because of the reproletarianization theory I've been working on, because this is what it all encapsulates. So yeah, I really wish I could just go, here's my pamphlet, but it's not published yet. It is finished, but it's in line behind another book. So yeah, that's it. I'm gonna leave my hand up though, because after we're done, I'll have questions.
You have a question from the live, yeah. Radhika.
Yeah, can I just quick, and actually, I thought Gabriel had his hand up as well. But I just wanted to say very quickly that, first of all, there are various ways of defining the working class, but to me, the best definition is that the working class is everyone who must work for a living, whether they are paid for it or not, and whether they are employed or not. I think, to me, that's a working class, but that's a very broad definition, and that would include the professional middle class, most of the middle classes. A second thing is that Poulantzas, of course, and I know Gabriel has difficulties with this, so I want to hear what he says. Poulantzas, of course, distinguish the old petty bourgeoisie and the new petty bourgeoisie. So, and the new petty bourgeoisie is precisely what we are calling the professional middle classes. So in that sense, at least that distinction is there, and we need to discuss it and its significance and what we can do with it, or whether we should simply discard it, etc., etc. So I just thought I would bring those 2 points up. Thanks.
Thank you. Gabriel, if you don't want to reply to that, maybe I have a quick comment before we get to the question that Noah has, but
I can say quickly, I think that Poulantzas' work, and there's other people like Albert Zemansky and others on the new petty bourgeoisie, I think is quite helpful. They're not shopkeepers in the traditional sense. Obviously, class formations, because class formations are relations, they evolve with the evolution of capitalism, and that the position that he takes, and what I agree with him on, and I think that you do too, Radhika, is that the new petty bourgeoisie tends to operate at a kind of managerial level. And he does insist on the strong Marxist point that at the end of the day, there are only really 2 classes. And so he tends to use vocabulary of class strata or class fractions or things like this, meaning that there are those who own the means of production and those who need to work for them in order to survive or find other ways of surviving. And so in that regard, the new petty bourgeoisie is this managerial class stratum that itself is ultimately working for the capitalists who have employed them in order to manage the workers. And so there's this kind of middle stratum, if you will. And I think that that is helpful for understanding some of the ways in which that stratum has evolved in the 20th century. I'll leave it at that.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, in Spanish, we have a concept that's not, it doesn't translate the same to English, which is el pueblo. It's got a very popular latent meaning in Spanish, and in English, when you say the people, it's like, well, you know, the bourgeoisie use the people quite often, but their bourgeois counterparts in Latin America, they're not using el pueblo. That's a popular, and I think that is a term that describes a concept that some folks in our tradition, some of the folks that some people might consider a bit scary, that Stalin described it as the working masses. There's a distinction between the working class and the working masses, which were working people of different sorts, but they weren't the traditional industrial proletariat. It's a term that in the US, through William Z. Foster, gets described as the toiling masses. And it's a way of speaking about perhaps this broader coalition of the people, or el pueblo, which are composed of different classes, all finding themselves in a contradictory position to the bourgeoisie, and perhaps finding themselves in a series of contradictions amongst the people themselves. And I think that part of what we're discussing here are 2 classes or stratums of the working masses that both have contradictions with the ruling class, but that find themselves with a certain degree of contradictions amongst the people that have been, of course, proliferated by that ruling class. But if there's no other comments on that question, Noah, you have a question from the audience?
Yeah, I actually have a quick comment on that. My presentation, as long and rambly as it was, actually went over this very point. And I think it's one that we could convene a panel to speak on, because without understanding the rise and fall of this group that we're talking about right now, we can't really understand where we are. And so it would be great to have a whole range of opinions discussed on it, for me, it's really always about going back to basic dialectics, right? And Engels in Anti-Düring and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, where he explains that the contradiction between bourgeoisie and proletariat, between owners and workers, arises as a reflection of production itself changing. The old relations of production are outmoded by the new forces of production, right? And that process doesn't stop just at industrial capitalism. It goes on into imperialism. And we seem to have this hole at the second stage of imperialism after Lenin, where we don't have an answer yet. Anyway, I'm not going to ramble even more. So this question is from Reclaim Dasein, who says, this is primarily for Rockhill. In which way can an intellectual avoid becoming the ultra one, that is to say, the discursive manifestation of the university discourse?
Well, I don't think there's a magic pill, but a lot of it has to do with the fundamental alignment of your theoretical practice. So what it is that you do as an intellectual. And for the sake of brevity, I would say that there are two fundamental orientations that I often encounter within the realm of the intelligentsia. The overwhelming majority of intellectuals are invested in a theoretical practice that is rooted in exchange value. And that consists in branding themselves and promoting their consumer products and using those to leverage up their careers and climb the social ladder. That's, as Carlos kind of quite eloquently put it in more existential terms, this is what day in and day out people are trained to do. They're conditioned opportunists, if you will. But there's another form of theoretical practice that I think most of us on this call, if not all of us, because I don't know everyone, would identify with, and that is an intellectual practice that is dedicated to use value. And that's very different, because it's not about coming up with a brand and marketing yourself and getting a following and all of this. It's about actually trying to develop forms of analysis that have real purchase in the world and connect with working people and the struggles for a more egalitarian society and a more sustainable society. And so at core, I think we really have to, as intellectuals, we have to ask ourselves these fundamental existential questions. What side are you on? Are you on the side of the opportunists, and are you pitching to empire and the capitalist ruling class in order to advance your career? Or are you on the side of those who are trying to, as difficult as it is, and fits and starts with setbacks and with loss in career opportunities as well, those who are trying to make a better world and who want to contribute intellectual tools to doing that, and therefore you're invested in real use value, often, again, at the expense of career and at the expense of visibility and other such things. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think my right contact is falling out. So tremendous time for such an occurrence.
You're crying, Carlos. It's good.
Yeah, you made me emotional.
Good. I'm glad you teared up.
Radhika, I saw your hand up, and I think Noah also has a question from the live audience. But Radhika, ask your question.
Right. I just wanted to say that, insofar as we're talking about this has been such a valuable conversation, and I think it needs to continue. So we can discuss the possibility of doing another webinar, but I just want to throw in a theme that I think should be part of that webinar in a small or big way. And that is that there is something very peculiar about neoliberalism. We have to understand just how intellectually dishonest it is. Right from the beginning, right from the moment of its emergence, it has essentially tried to deny the fact that capitalism is fake. Then when you put that to the right point at which capitalism is essentially past its sell-by date. It is ready to be overcome. And so the point is that essentially for the last century and a half, if I want to be extreme, we are paying the price of keeping capitalism alive. And therefore many of the distortions and many of the how can you call it? Many of the distortions and involutions of intellectual life itself should be connected with this fact. So yeah, I just wanted to say that we really need to bring that element of the theory of neoliberalism and the fact that monopoly capitalism is finished is into the picture.
Thank you so much. Totally agree. Noah?
Yeah, this question comes from Cristino Almonte, who asks, as we see the rise of the multipolar world, and as America slips more into fascism, what can we as intellectuals take advantage of the ensuing, or how can we as intellectuals take advantage of the ensuing anarchy? Why haven't we formed a workers' coalition? I'd like to take a quick stab at this if I could first, if that's okay.
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead.
I think the problem is actually what I've been sort of hinting at earlier, in that we have a working mass who sees falsification as what Marxism is. So as Marxist intellectuals specifically, and as radicals more broadly, we must find a way to engage in this sort of what Gramsci would call war of positions, by drawing a distinct line between them and us somehow. They are absolutely trying to disguise themselves with our symbols, our old slogans. I see every single day Marxism being used, but liberalism in substance. So finding a way to build something large enough and well-funded enough, and with enough theoretical correctness behind it to sort of shout down falsification, I think is the only way to do it in our era. And that includes, projects like we're all involved in already. So I would say, get involved in something like this. If you have something to contribute, everyone wants more help, wants to grow bigger, wants to include more people. You know what I mean? But that's it. I'll shut up.
I can add maybe an important thing, and this, unless there is disagreement, can maybe function as the last question we approach. But the UAW, one of the largest unions in the country, just recently endorsed a ceasefire. And the language that they used in that endorsement was very radical. It breaks quite a bit with the traditions of an aristocracy of labor that just went right along with imperialism and genocides and these horrendous things that we saw in the 20th century and that we continue to see in this century. It's after winning a decisive victory against the big three automobile companies, Stellantis, Ford, General Motors. As soon as it got the contract, it decided we're going to organize all unorganized workers within the automobile industry, and said that we want to schedule our contracts to end on the last day of April. Why? So that potentially all other unions, as they suggested in the country, can strike on the 1st of May, which, as we know, is International Workers' Day. It's not celebrated as International Workers' Day in the US, even though the event that it traces its roots to is in the US, in Chicago, the Haymarket riots. So I think we're already seeing a process whereby the working class foundation of a working class struggle for power is developing at the same time as the anti-imperialist struggle is expanding to levels of popularity that I don't think we've seen since perhaps the anti-Vietnam movement against the war in Vietnam. The percentage of the youth, people from 18 to 35 years of age that support a ceasefire and that have in their thinking deep sympathies with the plight of the Palestinians is nearing the 70 to 80% range. That is just completely unheard of. These are people that have already made slits in bourgeois narratives in one area, and like those fabrics that one tries to rip them apart, and when they're fully compact, you can't do it. But once you get the slightest bit of a slit into that fabric, you just rip it right apart quite easily. These are people that, by having questioned bourgeois narratives in one area, they're open to blowing the whole thing open. It's up to us to come to them and explain. People want to make sense of the world. And in my view, I guess most people here share it. It is only Marxism that allows us to make sense of the world, to understand the concrete concretely. So I think in previous eras, perhaps we could have looked at some divisions in the working class, things like racism and other factors as what is rooting the failure for the conquest for power. I think today we have to look at the left, we have to look at ourselves and how we can become better, more approachable, more flexible, how we can be better organizers, how we can learn how to start from the common sense of our people and reorient the rational kernels towards socialism, which in a country as large as the US and as culturally diverse, according to various regions, it means that we cannot have a one size fits all copy paste approach. We have to adjust to the specificities of the concrete conditions that we're working in. But
so I just want to add something. Yeah, the first Labor Day parade I attended in 1995, the front banner was the ILA, and it read, ILA means I love America. That was my introduction to American class politics. It's gone, it's finished, it's ended, because we have a generation that says, I think my job and my position and my status and my progress through the apparatus of the American state machine is less important than my human beings for what's happening to the women and people of Gaza. And this is a transitional moment. And that's what we've been talking about. So I just think it's so wonderful to be with people who support and defend. Everybody who stands with Palestine and chooses to stand up, even if the cost of any prospect of becoming a member of the bourgeoisie is taken from them. That's what solidarity really means. And I just welcome everybody here. We've just arrived in London. We confront this ghastly man, Keir Starmer, who is actually an appointee of the state. This is proven. Who now runs the Labour organisation of British working class. Let's hope his days are numbered.
Thank you so much for that, Alan. And as we wrap up, I want to remind you all that all sorts of events that we do nowadays as socialists have to, at some level, discuss the most principal dilemma we have in front of us, which is an ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. And the way that we've been thinking about this at the Institute has been the fact that there's two races. We have one race for a ceasefire to end the genocide, and we have to go as broad as we can with that race. And then there's a longer, that's the sprint. Then there's the longer marathon race, which is for justice, for removing the conditions that, in Kantian terms, create the conditions for the possibility of something such as what we're witnessing at the moment. And in my view, that takes the form of one secular state where, Palestinian Christians, Jews, and Muslims can live peacefully as they did before the intervention of imperialism in the region. But before we head out, I see that Gabriel had to go, but I think it would be good to, as we've done in the past, do a plug for the various organizations that co-sponsored this event. Radhika, do you want to tell us a little bit about the IMG, some of the work that you're doing, and where folks can find you?
Sure. I guess the International Manifesto Group started in the year 2020 when a bunch of us were trying to figure out exactly, how to make sense of the fast-paced changes that were taking place. And we started having group discussions. And then by the end of the year, we started having webinars, and we've not looked back since. We have since published a manifesto. It's called Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, which you can find on our website. It's www.internationalmanifesto.org. So please consider reading the manifesto. Please consider signing it. Please volunteer if you would like. Join us, donate to us, whatever you like to do. All of these things can be done via the website. And thanks very much for your attention. And we hope to come back in the new year with a whole range of very important and webinars, which we hope you'll join us in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Radhika. Yeah, please do make sure to check out the IMG, become a signatory, um, and promote it as much as you can, because you all are doing great work. Um, we will make sure to link the all of the institutional links to IMG, the critical theory workshop, to the folks watching the stream through YouTube live. And I think it's been linked to everything else we have promoted. As far as the Institute, it's been around for some years now, and it's an attempt to find some clarity in our confusing and complex time, and our methodology is Marxism. We have everything from a publishing press to a journal to weeks where we do 5 or 6 broadcasts. Now we just started doing broadcasts in Spanish with various specialists from around the world, and we do things like interviews, cover the news, and we have a website where we publish articles, and we have a Marxism school where we teach anywhere from 30 to 50, 60 people, uh, various classes. I taught one recently on Marxism and the history of Western philosophy. Noah has taught one on the basics of Marxism. We recently have a major party here in the US that has approached us to provide this class for their cadre that Noah would be leading. We have other classes. We're currently running a class, Educate Against Genocide, which is looking at the history of Zionism, imperialism, and the Palestinian plight, where we have various specialists come on and give classes. We just had Dan Cohen this past Thursday come on and give a class, and that class is led by Professor Danny Shaw, another professor of the Institute and at City University, New York. But I think that's all I have in terms of the plug for the Institute. No, I see your hand up. Is it quick because we're wrapping up?
Super quick. I just want to say that you can find where you can sign up for our classes, both Educate Against Genocide and anything else that might be coming in the future, such as Basics of Marxism, which will be running again soon in our link tree, on our website, on our YouTube, wherever.
Yeah, and that's just midwesternmarx.com. And as for Gabriel, again, another terrific organization. Please do check out the Critical Theory Workshop. We'll have all the links where you can find them in the description to these videos. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of those who are watching live. Thank you to those who were able to make financial contributions. Thank you to our speakers. And I think this was a tremendous event, trying to our best to tackle a monumental topic, and I think we did a fairly good job. With that, we'll get going. We can stop the recording, or you can stop the live. And yeah, thank you.
Bye, everybody.